Great, yeah, so let's start the session. So our first speaker is Cosimo Calabrò from McGill University, and the title of his paper is George Douglas MD and the Affirmation of the 18th Century English Anatomical and Scientific Body through Translation.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you for coming. In 2022, the journal Osiris dedicated a monographic issue to medicine and translation. Therein, the editors stated, until recently, histories of translation in science often excluded medicine from their purview. I would argue that history of translation in science very often excluded medicine from their purview. I would also argue that the dichotomy between science and medicine, especially in the early modern period, and especially when we are dealing with anatomy and surgery, is not helpful at all. To this end, today I will present the two translations produced by George Douglas, a very little known physician. My objective is to call attention to the field of translation studies that can be extremely helpful to historians of natural history, as seen in 18th century, when in dealing with medicine and materia medica, especially within the translation program. My chief business, therefore, as translator, was to express the author's thoughts in his own way, as far as was consistent with the propriety of the English anatomical style. So wrote in 1733 the physician George Douglas, in prefacing his translation of the Danish-born Jacques Bénigne Wislov, Exposition anatomique de la structure du corps humain, written 1 year earlier in French. Wislov also included in his treatise a reprint of the Discours sur l'anatomie du cerveau, Discourse on the Brain, originally delivered in 1665 and published in 1669 in Paris by his great uncle, the famous anatomist, geologist, science and polymath Niels Stensen, known in English as Steno. In addition to the English edition, Wislov's treatise was also translated into Latin, Italian, 7 editions, Dutch and German, covering the entire 18th century. Douglas' translation, titled An Anatomical Exposition of the Structure of the Human Body, was published between 1733 and 1734 in 2 volumes in quarto. The translation was financed through subscriptions and duly publicized in the newspapers. All also point out how, quote, nota bene, there are few copies printed on a fine paper. Sometimes translations are not born all equal.
You might have to press the buttons, maybe. Sorry about that.
The translation of Douglas included Steno's Discourse on the Brain, therefore representing the first published English translation of this fundamental tract on brain research and brain anatomy. Andrew Cunningham, in 2010, postulates that the translation of the Discourse on the Brain is somewhat free, and that the French texts need to be consulted. We will see that our notion of something free, somewhat free, as clear historical genealogy that needs to be traced and understood. The translated work, an anatomical exposition, became extremely popular throughout the 18th century and was used, mentioned, and parceled into the 19th century. It went through in English 6 editions with 2 5th editions. In 1733, George Douglas became a fellow of the Royal Society of London, in part on the strength of this translation. And the endorsement of a very extremely influential individual, such as Sir Hans Sloane and his brother James Douglas, an extremely famous physician, man, midwife, and polymath. Douglas' preface to his own translation offers a unique test with which to begin understanding translator strategies when approaching and consolidating the formation of a textual English anatomical body through translation in the early 18th century. Because of Douglas' clearly stated modus operandi, ultimately the question is the following: how to define the propriety of the English anatomical style that Douglas strove to achieve? Circulation of anatomical knowledge offers several challenges because of the nature of the discipline itself. Indeed, it is useful to remember that anatomy is a multifaceted discipline that implied multiple forms of communication and diverse skills, ranging from tacit knowledge, written, oral, as well as visual procedures, ultimately beginning with the acquisition of a corpse, the actual dissection, and the preparation of different preparations and experimental procedures. Therefore, the difference or the dichotomy between science and medicine with anatomy is of little use. Clear precepts on how to translate effectively only began to emerge in England during the 17th century. And they crystallized through the famous person, the poet and translator, John Dryden. We owe to John Dryden a three-pronged translation theory. The first he called metaphrase, implied a word-by-word translation. The second he defined as paraphrase, implied a sense-for-sense translation that did not follow the wording of the original verbatim. In this sense, Dryden here is studying Cicero, who famously said that he was translating ad sensu, meaning no literally. The third part, Dryden called imitation, followed neither the original wording literally nor the textual sense. This, in essence, was an adaptation. The extent to which these precepts were applied to medical translations is not yet clear. However, it is worth noticing that many physicians were indeed literati and could have easily been aware of intricate literary discourses, at least technically, as dilettanti. George Douglas would have been aware of all these discourses. In fact, in his Royal Society acceptance, he was said to be well versed in polite literature. Douglas aggressively explains his choice of nomenclature as follows. I have given most of the terms of art in Latin because they are most familiarly used by English anatomists in that language. And for that reason, I judge them to be as really English words, as they have been originally delivered to us from the Britons, Saxons, Danes, or Normans. For, after all, the efforts made wherever by grammatical or logical pedants, use will be and must remain the sole standard, both for speaking and writing. Use. In practice, Douglas naturalized Latin and in so doing extended the lineage of the English vernacular. But he also seemed to have completely disregarded the efforts made wherever by grammatical or logical pedants, leaving open the question wherever or not he was referring to the current literary discussions on translation. For Douglas, anatomy was to be written and explained in pedagogical terms and according to established and common use. However, despite his apparent dismissal of translation precepts, he does appear to be fully aware of them. Indeed, he clearly states what he believes to be the generally accepted rule for an appropriate translation. Quote, it is laid down as a general rule that in all translations, the author ought to be made to express himself in the same as if he had written originally in the language into which his work is translated. The general rule is in fact extremely similarly to what Dryden already had proposed. However, Douglas believed that this rule that I already quoted applied only to dead languages, Greek and Latin. Indeed, he writes, but with respect to the French originals, this rule must admit of some limitations. The limitations appear to focus as much on the two languages as to the native audiences, in this case, French and English readers. First, Douglas says, that the generality of the French writers think themselves obliged to express a great many things which the English leave to be supplied by their readers. And secondly, that the French words are in many cases sign of less complex idea than the English. From these two principles, Douglas writes, quote, that the French are the best writers on the element of sciences, and the English writings are a great deal more concise than the French. In addition to extol the numerous virtues of Wislow's treatise and consequently the necessity of his own translation, it is extremely useful to underscore a few small faults that Douglas imputes to Wislow. These mistakes are four in number and all relate to the use of language and the pedagogy involved in teaching anatomy. The first is the overuse of analogies taken from other fields, such as architecture, fortification, carpenter work. The second error is the use of too many mathematical terms, because only few of them, according to Douglas, would be beneficial to both medicine and surgery. Douglas also begs the students reading his translation that Winslow is a much better anatomist than a mathematician. However, the last two errors are particularly important in the field of translation and medical and surgical lexicon. One related to anatomical nomenclature, and the second to the more general anatomical lexicon. I must say that both issues are still currently in 224, in medicine, surgery, and anatomy now, are still presently unresolved in numerous medical specializations. Douglas disagrees with Winslow for endeavoring to introduce a great number of new terms of art. According to Douglas, all these new words will push the students not to study anatomy, that is to say, not to dissect, but to, quote, amount now to no more than to oblige students to learn a dictionary by heart. The final point is Winslow very often substituted new anatomical terms, old anatomical terms, what he regarded to be new. This was another problem according to Douglas. And he says that this problem, well, is even more unwarrantable than the former. Douglas' textual anatomical body is expedient, succinct, and pedagogical. It is a body that is constructed by translations, plural practices, that occupy the present. Use will and must remain the sole standard, both for speaking and writing. Douglas' translation is made up by the translator, the reader, and the operator, the anatomist, and also by the corpse itself. The second book translated by George Douglas is a completely different book. The second book translated by George Douglas is titled A Treatise of Fossils, Vegetable and Animal Substances that are made use in physics. Contrary to the previous book, Douglas did not translate from an already printed source, but from a manuscript copy of a French physician, Etienne François Geoffroy. Equally different from his first translation is the fact that George Douglas does not specifically mention the language he translated from. The language could have been two, French or Latin. Because Dr. Geoffroy, he was a professor in different very important institutions in France, in Paris. In some instances, he would have been taught in French. In other instances, he would have been teaching in Latin. Therefore, it's extremely complicated to get the manuscript that precisely pointed to the source. This translation does not enter in any discussion or language. However, enter into the discussion why the translation appeared in 1736 and why the translation was publicized, specifically point out that this book contained the largest treaty of cinnabar and quicksilver written until the moment. The translation was precisely produced in a moment where in London there was an extremely important debate about the use of mercury or quicksilver in order to cure venereal diseases, e.a. syphilis. And specifically in the advertisement is written that this can be done. This book did not become famous as the first book. And we have even an interesting comment written in 1770 by a professor of botany and materia medica in Edinburgh, who, thinking back, wrote, Dr. Douglas gained little honor by the translation or the advertisement concerning it, with which the newspapers were stuffed for a considerable time. So the story of Dr. Douglas appeared to end here, but the story of the remarkable book of Dr. Jawhar will continue. In 1741, there was a Latin edition printed in Paris. The Latin edition was later translated in English as a treatise on foreign vegetable. The story does not finish here. We continue because in 1751, these are old editions. These are old editions. But in 1751, so this is the 1749. In 1751, a new treatise on British and foreign vegetable appeared. The 1749 simply says a treatise on foreign vegetable. Number two, the translator completely disappeared. And number three, and this will be the last point, the marketing became very large. The first book has practically no marketing in the cover page. In the second book, 1751, we see that is marketed to everybody, from households to physicians. These books, finally, will also have 17 tomes in French. Therefore, why Dr. Douglas was the first one to extract this knowledge from a manuscript into English. The story of Dr. Jawhar will continue in many languages, and you see British and foreign. There is also this dichotomy. The last comment that I want to say is this with regard to the anatomy. In 1732, Winslow wrote and Douglas translated. It is no purpose to dispute about words when we are agreed as to things themselves. The construction of the English anatomical body, as well as the construction of the therapeutic English body, is still in progress. Winslow's recommendation about the futility of lexical dispute once something is unanimously recognized is at the best contradictory. Indeed, as one of the most important anatomists of the 18th century, he would have been certainly recognized. He would have certainly recognized that too often is the words itself that define those things in the translation of it. Thank you very much.
Very much. We have just very little time for questions, comments, if you have any, or the online.
Well, I do. Do
Yeah.
you?
Go ahead, actually, please.
Okay. I'll be very quick. I'm starting from bottom. So the Edinburgh Professor of Materia Medica, was that John Hope or Alexander Walker?
Allora, professor. Allora, professor from Edinburgh was Charles Alston.
Alston, correct.
Alston at the time was dead. His manuscript was recollected by Professor, I can show you the.
Actually,
the
I've
pages.
seen one of those manuscripts as well.
Yes. The person who collected those manuscripts is Professor John Hope.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
And this is 2 volumes.
Yeah.
And I strongly do recommend these 2 volumes because Professor Alston, having seen the McGill book myself, review it, the original one, he really reviewed all the translation very meticulously. And he also says a very interesting thing. Professor Alston says, I didn't see too much English, my apologies. I didn't see too much Latin in Professor Douglas' translation. That is an extremely puzzling statement. In order to figure it out, did he translate from French or from Latin?
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, thank you very much.
Thank you to you,
This is
Professor.
really interesting.
Thank you,
I
ma'am.
wonder if our next speaker is online.
Yes, so our next speaker is online and waiting for us, but not on the Zoom portal. For some
Oh.
reason, today he's not able to get in the portal.
Ah,
So we have created a new Zoom link for anyone online to join us there. And we will present his talk here through.
yeah,
So I'm so sorry, I have